So you've got these contrasts here between Babylon is seducing people with immorality. God is creating this mixture that they're going to have to drink that's based on his wrath. And then you have this image of the reapers going out into the world, these angelic reapers. Even the Lord is named as one of these reapers that's coming in the form of an angel that's collecting things to put into a winepress that is feeding God's wrath. I got to ask, if there's a section in Revelation where the imagery just really makes me scratch my head, it's this one. So how can we simplify what's going on here? I mean, this is going to be a big deal throughout the rest of the book, particularly the bowls of wrath that seem to be pouring out what's being gathered here. Are we seeing that? Are we seeing heaven paying attention to everything that people are suffering? Are we literally talking about the oppressors being drawn out of the world and crushed under the wrath of God? What are we talking about here?
Jared, is a lot of immorality bad?
A lot of immorality is bad, yes.
Is a little bit of immorality bad?
A little immorality is bad, yes.
So all this is being designed to teach, verse 8, is that you can have no amount of wine, not a lot or a little, because a lot is bad and also a little is bad. This is an abstinence of wine text, and that's all I have to say about that. I'm not suggesting anything on wine except that would be a misuse of this. I'm not real clear on this imagery that much as well, honestly. I just think that if you're confused, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to articulate what you should do if you're confused. If you hit a spot like this in this revelation and you're like, the wine and the bowls and the significance of connecting it to immorality, I don't understand. Just remember that we're dealing with cycles. Remember that what you're seeing is just sort of look at it this way, okay? Now look at it this way. Now I'm going to show you the same thing. Look at it this way. It's true of the trumpets and the bowls and all these different sevens that we've looked at. In some way, this is revisiting this idea of God's anger towards the sin of the world and his imminent judgment upon them. It's going to lead to the same conclusion, which is salvation for the faithful. And this is a good text because I struggle with this one too, Jared, other than using it as an abstinence from beverage text. But I don't get lost in it.
Coffee, Kris.
I don't get lost in it because it's not a left field different idea. It's just another envisioning of the same idea. Evil, judgment, and ultimate victory. Chapter 15 is so great because however you look at this, you're always going to return to victory and justice from God. You can cut out all the alcohol stuff if you want. It's up to you.
Brian?
So one thing, too, I think, is that, again, we're also getting a lot of Old Testament parallels. This statement in verse 8 is a statement found back in the book of Isaiah as well about Babylon has fallen. And in the Old Testament, I think sometimes it's easier to discern that God is just talking about his wrath coming upon a nation for their unrighteousness again and again and again. I mean, that's how many of the Old Testament prophets is that the whole point of their book? Is to talk about God's wrath on a nation, that God judges nations. And so I see the value here as being to the big picture as opposed to the details. I see the value as being, God has judged nations in the past, and we want to get a sense that God is bringing his wrath on a nation now. And that would be the big picture I think we would want to walk away with.
We like to say, hate the sin and love the sinner. And there's truth to that. There's a lot of places where the Bible teaches having compassion on those who are in sin, but at a nationalistic level, when you're judging nations, that God is not really distinguishing the sin from the sinner here, because as they're oppressing his people, their immorality is intertwined at a very deep level, and it's the reason why he's judging them. And what I guess after studying this book for nearly 20 years or over 20 years, that I don't really know that there's a distinction as John is presenting this between the people and the immorality that they're being judged for, particularly as it pertains to the persecution of his church. Now, from a very literal sense, there is a very literal way that immorality led to the destruction of Rome, that it was just like a cancer that ate it up from the inside. But I really don't I don't think that that's exactly what he's emphasizing here. I think he's emphasizing judgment. And Rome is, or the Babylon, because it doesn't matter what time frame we're talking about here. Babylon is pumping out immorality. It's calling people to drink from it. As it's pumping out immorality, God is pumping out a river of wine that's blood, that is based on his wrath. He's angry about what this city is doing to his people and what it's doing to his creation. And you really see that when in verse 19, when it says, "So the angel swung his sickle to the earth and gathered the clusters from the vine of the earth and threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside of the city, and blood came out of the winepress up to the horses' bridles for a distance of about 200 miles." You think about a river that's 200 miles long or 200 miles wide, depending on how you think about it, and it's as deep as a horse's bridle. That's a lot of wrath.
Let me comment on that. A more serious comment about the chapter is I think of it like a cup with wine in it, but there's two elements in the wine, and you can't separate the two elements. If you want to drink of the cup, a lot or a little of immorality, and whatever that means, whatever impurity that means, if you choose to buy into what they're selling, which is here, drink this, in that same cup is the wrath of God, and you cannot separate the two elements. If you drink of immorality, then you drink of the wrath of God. If you are taking in one, then God will deliver the other as well. And that's an important modern message, especially in the way that we think about the body and our behavior and so forth, is you can't take in immorality and also take in the holiness of God.
One of the other things that I think we should be careful not to separate is that all of this is part of this seventh trumpet, which is the pronouncement of the reign of Christ. And the reign of Christ we think of as the pouring out of the mercy and the grace of God upon men. I mean, Romans 5 tells us exactly that. But it's also the calling men out of sin, because sin, the wages of sin, is death. And this imagery of the wine, I think Kris is spot on, that you can't drink of the one without drinking of the other. And then you see this proclamation in chapter 15 about the holiness of Christ, or the wrath of God, and the throne room's changed. It looks like the crystal sea is on fire in the throne room all of a sudden, and God is being praised because of his mighty works. In verse 3 it says, "And they sang the song of Moses, the bondservant of God, the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and marvelous are your works, O Lord God, the Almighty. Righteous and true are your ways, King of the nations. Who will not fear, O Lord, and glorify your name? For you alone are holy, for all the nations will come and worship before you, for your righteous acts have been revealed." This is called God's righteousness. He's right in judging with wrath the immorality and the wickedness of this nation. And you see this vision of the tabernacle, and it's filling. I mean, last time we saw the tabernacle, the ark was thundering inside it. Now it's filling with the holiness of God. It's filling with the smoke. And immediately after that, we have the outpouring of these vessels of wrath in chapter 16. Again, these 7 bowls of wrath seem to be under the 7th trumpet. It all seems to pertain to seeing Jesus as reigning in heaven. But now, instead of things that are just generally affecting the earth, he's talking about, and Kris was mentioning cycles earlier, he's talking about how these things affect men in a very literal way. He's talking about plagues, human-centric types of judgment. How are these things connected? I mean, these are passages that people look at and go, oh yeah, end time. We're looking for fiery hail, 100-pound hailstones to be flung down out of heaven. We're looking for plagues. We're looking for diseases. I mean, people are practically assigning zombie apocalypses to the book of Revelation. How are these things connected to the holiness of God?
Kind of as a side note, this is a little different direction. Just to say, one of the images that's constantly given, and I think it's important to grab it here with the harvesting of the grapes, is that God waits for things to ripen. I was remembering back when the first times God talked about judging a nation, he talks about judging the Amorites, and he says the wickedness of the Amorites has not yet reached its fullness. That God has this sense of he's patient with a nation for a time, that even when they're have wicked behavior, and we've seen already the saints pleading for justice, and God's patient, and he's waiting for a degree of wickedness to ripen that's part of the imagery of this harvest coming forth at the right time. That God is waiting for this wickedness to ripen, to reach a point where, you know, he's prepared to take action. Not exactly what you asked there, though, but
yeah, that's okay. I think it goes hand in hand with it. That, I mean, part of the holiness of God is that he does see the long term. He waits for, as he did with the Amorites, for their wickedness to be filled, and that, yeah, it wasn't right to judge them at the place they were in. The place where you see that's Jonah. I mean, God relented from judging them, Nineveh, at that point in time because they responded to Jonah's message, and it really is one of those places where we just have to accept we're not in the place of God. We're not in the place of God when he brings about the downfall of a nation, and it's catastrophic, and it is, you have a great nation just suddenly coming apart at the seams. Almost like this whole section is just saying God is right in using these things. It is right for him to respond to immorality in this way when he has judged that the time has come for him to act.
Yeah, and just to tie the next few chapters together, because I think you're kind of leaning into hopefully getting us to this nice, incredible last section. But I've got some notes here on 16, 17, and 18. You know, chapter 16, you have all these 7 bowls, and it's all the judgments, a lot of what we've seen. And then he gets into details in chapter 17 about the woman riding the beast. And I've got some notes here. It's kind of hard to pinpoint all the details, but I know that the woman is evil. Mm-hmm. And I think God is saying in this last run through, like, here we go. I'm going to tell you one more time, and I will crush these people. I have to crush these people. The cup of my wrath is pouring over, as is the cup of their sinfulness. The woman may represent the city of Rome. It's up to you to decide, but I know this, the woman is evil. The beast that she's riding on with 7 heads and thorns and horns, you know, probably the Roman Empire. You can think of Rome sitting on the empire. It's evil, okay? The cities are evil. The government is evil. The entire empire is evil. But let me tell you who's not evil, the Lamb. The Lamb is righteous, and the righteous ruling Lamb will battle the dragon, the sea beast, the land beast, this beast, the woman riding on the beast, because all of them are incomplete and evil, and the Lamb is righteous. And of course, we have that beautiful, beautiful verse in 17:14. You got to know 17:14. If you leave here with one verse in your memory, make it this one. These will wage war against the Lamb. These evil things, cities, rulers. We can go like ruler, city, empire, whatever. Mm. And the Lamb will overcome them. Because why? He is Lord of Lords. They may be a Lord, but he's Lord of Lords. They may be a king, but he's the King of Kings. And those who are with him are the called and the chosen and the faithful. And so chapter 18 kind of wraps it up and says, woe to this great city, Babylon the Great. I don't care how great they are, how big they are, how many people they've killed, how deceptive they've been, how many beasts are in their herd, or how ugly the dragon is. It doesn't matter. They will be paid back, chapter 18, for their arrogance. They will be paid back for their sensuality, chapter 18, verses 1 through 10. They will no longer be the center of all material things, not even material things, much less spiritual things. They will be thrown down with violence because of their violence against God's people. Now, we've seen all that already, cyclically. So align yourself with the Lamb, not with any nation above the Lamb, because
and I think that's why you see the bowls come in such quick succession, Chris. I mean, it does mean something for the first century reader. This literally was about the circumstances that they end up in, or that they existed in. But you also see that, yeah, there's a relevancy here for all time. That immorality, particularly when that immorality is directed at the persecution or the deception of the people of God, really makes God angry. And as you know, we individually store up wrath for ourselves when we don't turn to Jesus, surrender to him. The nations, we don't think about this a lot, store up wrath for themselves as you know, through the immorality. And that's why God, you know, elevates one and casts another down. But at the same time, what you see is that his judgment is not based on God's anger alone. It is earned through the immorality of those nations, and you see that in the fifth bowl, the fifth vessel, where he's literally pouring out the wine of his anger on the seat of the power of that nation. And literally Rome in the first century, probably. Is it always Rome? No, it's always Babylon. That's why he uses the term Babylon. It's the world city. Jeff Wilson, I think you and I were both sitting in that discussion, Kris, when Jeff Wilson said, the real secret to Babylon is it's always Babylon. It's always the world city. That the powers of this earth don't ever align with God. They always align with immorality. And what you see here in between the sixth and seventh bowl, and Brian, I'm going to let you take this one because I really need you to say what you've been saying all along. You see Armageddon, and it's going to really disappoint some of our viewers if this is your first time going through Revelation. Armageddon is 3 verses long, literally 3 verses. So let me ask this question and beat you to the punch, Brian. What isn't Armageddon? Before we get into, I think Kris probably already told us what it is. What is Armageddon not?
This is very churchy of us. Like, we're really good at what things aren't. Let's start there with our strong suit.
Yeah, Armageddon is not a battle. For one thing, it's kind of interesting that it doesn't really sum it up, even though people see it as one. We just see it as a gathering of enemies. And perhaps what we're seeing, we have a new enemy introduced in the false prophet there in verse 13. And so we just see this gathering of enemies coming together. But what it is not, it's not a battle. It's not a battle. Certainly, it's not a battle at the end of time. It's not some great coming together, of the enemies of God, in a future sense here either. All it amounts to is just trying to suggest that, that this, that the whatever they want to do against God, they're just not even going to be able to get it off the ground. There is some things to think about with the meaning of the word Armageddon, Harmageddon. This area. Some people tie it to the idea of this is, where enemies, when they invade Israel, necessarily stop geographically to prepare themselves to invade. So, it might have that significance of that, or it just could be that the word itself, I think the word in Hebrew, the Megiddo, it refers to a gathering. So it could just be that as well. I don't even like to make too much of a, statement other than he uses, sometimes he gets these funny words, Apollyon, Abaddon, he likes to play with the words, but in the end, they're just meant to invoke a seriousness to this. But there's nothing of substance here. As you said, 3 verses. And as I said, it doesn't even indicate that there's a battle. It just indicates that the judgment is brought down.
So what you're saying is I don't get a sword.
That's right. That's right.
Probably for the best.
I studied with a guy once. I recall a guy once who said, "Hey, when is it in the Bible that we all get to have swords and we go into the bars and kill people?" That was, he asked that in the study.
Well,
you'll want to cut that part.
Yeah, not there. Whatever passage you're thinking of, it's not that one. So, Kris mentioned that it's possible from this point to just see 17 through 20 as another expression of God's judgment. It doesn't matter how big and bad the forces of wickedness are in this world. It doesn't matter how much immorality they're pumping out. Ultimately, Jesus is victorious. And you see this with the destruction of the harlot. It's riding on the beast. That she's, at the beginning of 17, she is presented as something awesome. By the end of 17, she's been thrown down. The beast is devouring her. Again, we don't need to literally get into that. I think you could probably make an argument for wickedness devouring itself in the judgment of God, that wicked men just kind of devour themselves. But the lament over her destruction is very real. That the nations of the earth are lamenting when the judgment of God happens, even if they aren't specifically being judged at that time. But when you get into chapter 19, God's being praised for doing this. When we look at chapters 17 through 20, are we talking about future imagery? Or what did a first century reader get out of these things?
I'll go short. I don't think there's anything in our future in 17 through 20. I think when you get down into chapter 21 and 22, that's when there's almost a mountain range possibility. If you've ever looked at 2 mountains that look like they're really close together and you looked at them from the side and they're actually really far apart, there may be some immediate and forecasted. 17 through 20, no. In short order, all of the 1,000-year stuff, everybody wants to talk about the 1,000-year reign and Satan being released in chapter 20, verse 7, and the battle. There is, to this point, no indication in the text that says you can jump from the first century mountain to the 21st century or the future. It's just not there. To me, that means Revelation 20 isn't the fodder that people think that it is. I've certainly preached on it. People want to know about the 1,000-year reign. I don't see any reason to forecast it forward. I think it fits into their time. That's confusing because people want to know what's 1,000 years and how do you fit that in there. And as soon as you start taking the years and the months and trying to make them literal, you're going to run into problems no matter where you are. So Brian can fix me on this, but nothing is forecasted in that text from here for me.
I do think that maybe this last part of chapter 20 is the future. You know, the language about judgment fits nicely to the day of judgment, and I like that with the second resurrection and things like that. So I like putting it together. There's a couple of times I think in Revelation where there is a jump. There was a parenthetical statement there in chapter 16 where he talks. He just throws it out there in verse 15. Behold, I'm coming as a thief. Blessed is he who watches, keeps his garment on, lest he walk naked and see his shame. I think that little statement is fascinating because it really is out of the context of the conversation. It seems to be a reference to the day that comes as a thief in the night, described in other places. I find it interesting, but honestly, after chapter 20, I'm still not sure we're in the future. I'm not sure we're jumping back and forth, and there's nothing about 20 that I say has to be the future either, but we do want to be careful to say, I don't think we can bring some parts of chapter 20 into the future. I think we have to say they're in the past. Way back in chapter 1, Jesus said he had already been given the keys, to bind up in Hades. So, there's a sense where we have to be reading some things that are in the past right there because Jesus said in the very beginning they were. So, like I said, it doesn't give me any kind of heartache to see it, little variations here. The bigger idea is we're not talking about something that Jesus has yet to do as far as setting up his kingdom or something like that. That's really the big idea that we kind of focus in on.
Brian, from the way my brain sequences things, I've gone back and forth on the one that you're referencing. I think all of us get up through chapter 20 around verse 10, and we kind of see all that as the same kind of stuff we've been seeing, the judgment, whatever the releasing is and all that. And then, like Brian said, in chapter 20, verses 11 through 15, you're just almost begged to forward this thing to this final judgment. Is it possible chapter 20, verses 11 through 15 is still articulating elements of first century judgment? Sure it is, and probably would have drawn to that. But is it also saying, let's fast forward? And I think God has the right to do that. God has the right to do anything. But we know in chapter 1, this whole letter's, let me rephrase. We know in chapter 1, the content of this letter is the things as much which must shortly take place. But does God not have the right at the end to give you a longer view? We know that he does. As far as Brian's comment goes, I've changed more towards 11 through 15 being final judgment because I'm drawn more and more in chapters 21 and 22 to not the church on earth, but the church in heaven. I'm not totally in on that. I'm still very much confused, and I kind of go, if you go this way, you're right. If you go that way, you're also right.
Well, maybe you're not confused, Kris.
Brian's good at saying too to make me feel better.
Maybe that's how it should be read. Chapter 17 through the beginning of 21 really is emphasizing that God will deal with nations. He will deal with them in the short term. He will deliver his people. But he's also going to judge nations. The contrast is in chapter 21, beginning in verse 10, what we begin to see is the reassurance, the comfort of God's people that not only have they been delivered from judgment, but that they have fellowship with God that they need to stay focused on. They have a fellowship with Christ. They have a union with him that when you lose sight of that, you lose sight of something really important. Now, Kris, I know you've been dying to get here. Chapter 21 begins with this vision of this heavenly city coming down from that's called the New Jerusalem. Before we get into any discussion of the eternal, think about a first century reader sitting in one of those 7 churches. What do they see when they get to this vision?
Yeah, I think some some short-term application is beneficial if you're a first century reader. This idea of a new heavens and a new earth, this holy city, New Jerusalem. And verse 2 says coming down out of heaven, which kind of articulates that it might be on earth, that there would be a restoration and a newness. And a pretty typical take on this by some very smart men. Weldon Warnock, one of my favorite men in the faith, who passed away a handful of years ago. Great little book on Revelation. And he just keeps this to the age of the church that was to come, that there would be a time when the church on earth would not suffer that kind of persecution. And he would look at verse 4, wipe away the tears. There was so much crying, so much death, so much mourning and uncertainty, and those times would pass away. And one of the things I always struggled with, but some prophetic, just to do Brian's job for him again, some Old Testament prophetic reading will change is, you look at that and you go, well, that can't be talking about the restoration of peace for the church, because it's been 2,000 years and the church did not always have peace after that. And there was times of persecution again. But a lot of times when God speaks of like sending off Israel to Babylonian captivity, Judah, he talks about when he brings them back, how everything's going to be magnificent and great, and hopeful. And you say, well, that didn't happen forever, but it did happen after the event in question. After the 70 years in captivity, they were given this great amount of freedom. Did it last? No. And God wasn't saying it would always be, because sin would always mess things up. So when I read this, I was always confused of, well, but there's still a lot of crying and death and persecution that came to the church in the 2,000 years since. But he's really saying for them, for you guys, the kind of mourning and pain and trouble you're experiencing, God will relieve you of it. There will be a new age for the church that will not be like this. And that's important for them, because it's easy for them to think, well, I'll be dead soon, so I'm going to go be in the throne room of God and not worry about it anymore. But they have kids, and their kids have kids. And I want to know that it's going to be okay for my kids. And so while I have leaned increasingly in the last 10 years towards heaven here for various reasons, I cannot do so to the full abandonment of first century, second century, third century hope for these people's great grandkids, when God would take that away, and those who continue in their sin will be punished, and God is always going to make things right in his time.
Brian, before I jump in with my take, tell us what it isn't, and give us some thoughts.
Well, of course, the biggest idea, it isn't the concept of a kingdom waiting to be established. The from the very beginning, you want to tie what's said at the beginning and end as a concise nature. He talked about us in the beginning being the kingdom of kings and priests, and then at the end in chapter 20, we're still talking about the same thing, us being the kingdom of kings and priests. And of course, that's language other writers use too. The royal priesthood that Peter speaks of in 1 Peter 2. That's language that we want to grab again and again and again. I'll actually say something similar we said before. I kind of am not sure what to think of the language after chapter 20 towards that which will be in the future, or the heavenly reward, or just describing the kingdom without the persecution, where those circumstances exist. And I'm just not sure, because I even once wrote in some notes of mine, how much does it matter if the church and the kingdom are those that are with God? Then in either circumstance, we're simply talking about the setting, not the people, because the setting is either in the future or now, but either way, it's the same group. It's those that belong to God. And even some of the language where it draws, these Old Testament saints in too, that brings up this idea of, I'm not sure how important it is to really parse that out. And it might be pretty important, and I'm just, not.
Well, and that's sort of the strange thing about this particular a purely earthly view of this that gets taken by a lot of the denominations is, if you don't have a literal dragon and you don't have a literal woman giving birth to a literal baby that's comes out and is immediately taken up to heaven, to make this a literal kingdom sitting on literal earth when we're told that heavens and earth are going to pass away, is a very strange way of reading a letter. It's picking and choosing what you want to make literal. When maybe the best commentary on this section is in 21 verse 7, where it says, "He who overcomes will inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son." And I think you guys both said something pretty profound. I don't know that it matters. Is there comfort from God to his people in the temporary? Absolutely. Absolutely there is. Is there eternal comfort with God before his throne in heaven? Absolutely there is. We are made to anticipate the latter because we see the former. And if you notice from 21 and beyond, I haven't found a single instance where, with the exception of maybe the leaves on the tree, we're told these are specifically for the healings of the nation. I haven't found anything that is one of those call-outs where an angel says, "John, do you know what this is?" and then tells him specifically what it is. So you've got this city. It's envisioned on these 12 perfect foundations, and you could maybe make a rainbow out of them if you wanted to. That if you the colors of those stones could make kind of a rainbow type image there. But it's just this awesome city. It's perfect in its measurements. The streets are envisioned with gold. The temple God isn't there because God is literally with his people here. What we're seeing is just a lot of comfort here. You go into the city and you've got the river of life flowing from the throne of God and flowing from Christ. You've got the tree of life that people are eating from. The leaves are healing the nations, and the nations are walking by the light of the one of God and of Christ. And the end of our story is God. The end of our story is Jesus.
The end of our story is all these beautiful things. It's so beautifully laid out. It makes me think of heaven. It's what I envision heaven being like. Of course, heaven is a spiritual place, and the only way that humans like us can understand it is by giving it some imagery that draws us in and brings comfort to us. And the idea of the tree and the light and the water and the nourishment, I mean, man, it's beautiful. I've done a lot of Google searches trying to find an artist rendering of some of this, and there's just nothing that can touch it. It's got this multifaceted light and temple and all this. And, what I wrestle with is, what is it talking about? Is it talking about is it signifying the peace that we have in his church that would be restored more after the Romans were stopped and that would kind of permeate our character? Yeah, I mean, I feel like I live in this garden now because I'm nourished by God. And the light of my life is Jesus. And I think more people in the church ought to be living as if this is their present condition in the Lord. But then I wrestle with the fact that that's not real life a lot. I mean, I'm living in this flesh that I battle every day, and nations are still against us. And so I want to look at this as where we're going to be in such a short time when we pass from this earth and the Lord returns, and I'm going to be in this great place. And I don't think it matters which one you decide, because, and you guys use this phrase a lot. I try not to use this phrase because I feel like it's just preacher talk, but I'm going to use it once anyway. In the sense that, which just kind of opens up whatever you want to say, in the sense that there is peace now and God's presence now and just the hem of the garment of what is coming.
The one thing that's interesting about scriptures is that they, anywhere else in the New Testament, we get so few images of heaven, of what eternal life is like. And I can't help but to wonder if it's maybe something where Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians 2:12, things, visions that I can't speak about, that there's a sense where just nothing is going to reflect it well. I think that absence of description, either this is just trying to give us a feeling, an emotional sense of what it is, or it's following that pattern. Either could be true. But more importantly, what we want to understand is that the reward is so great that it's going to be worth whatever it takes to get there.
Yeah, I look at this, and
one of the big things,
and I don't want to cap it off too much, but it almost cheapens the image when you try to take apart the image and say, okay, streets of gold are this, foundations are this, here's the reason why you have gates of pearl. I think you're just supposed to be in awe of it. I think you're supposed to see this and go, wow, yeah, the struggle was really worth it. John's told not to seal up the messages of this book, that he needs to take these messages. He's also gives a warning at the end of the book. Jesus is reassuring us of his return, that we're told about those that are outside of the city and what they represent. Looking at the last few verses of Revelation chapter 22, verses, let's say 10 through 21. What are we taking from that, guys?
I'll sum mine up quickly. Wash your garments. If you're not in alignment with the Lord, get in alignment with the Lord. If your entire church, if the culture of your entire local church is not in alignment and you're drinking out of cups that you shouldn't be drinking out of, then repent and wash your garments and get right with him, because there's no argument that can be made against that. And you don't want the wrath of God on you that's coming upon these nations. And then I love the word come. The Spirit says to you to come, and you should be telling everyone else to come. It has, to me, that evangelistic tilt to it. Verse 17, the Spirit and the bride say, come, and let those who hear say, come, and let the one who is thirsty come, let the one who wishes to take the water of life without cost. There should be an evangelistic element to this. If you read Revelation or you go through this study, and at the end, one, you're not committed to repent of the things that are amiss, and two, you're not compelled to share with everyone that they need to come, then something is wrong in your heart. Maybe you're a donut and there's no heart like the people in Ephesus, or maybe you need to go and read it again, because the result is, I want to be right with God and I want to draw people into this walk, even though this walk is a challenge.
Yeah, this last part of the chapter preaches the best. Probably every preacher knows that. We like to pull it up and just start talking through it about, I love, it was already mentioned, but I love the Spirit and the bride say, come. It's a great invitation. It's a great opportunity to think of the fullness of that. There's the admonition about the characteristic of the Word of God, and that's an important thing, and I've often thought, that while maybe Revelation may not be the last book written, or maybe it is, whatever, it's interesting that we can go to the end of the Bible and find an admonition like this. I just find it a useful thing to see as well. Just that there's just so much here at the end that really is the important call to action, and that's every preacher knows we end our message with a call to action. Here's what you need to do. You need to stay pure. You need to stay faithful. If your garments are dirty, you need to get them cleansed. If you've got clean garments, you need to keep them on. Blessed is he that keeps his garment on, so that his nakedness isn't seen. This is the admonition that sums up what are we supposed to do with this. We're supposed to hang in there because the reward is fantastic. The penalty is awful, and God knows what we're going through.
Yeah, you really have this thought of whosoever will may come. And he said it's very much in Isaiah 55 kind of thing. You do this without cost. Even though it costs you everything, it's still without cost, because you can't buy this. It has to change you completely, but it's grace, because you can't buy this. You can't expend enough goodness. You can't expend enough fortune. You can't expend enough treasure to buy your place in the kingdom of the Lamb, or to this wedding feast. He wants to give it to you, but he's only going to give it to you if you respond to his invitation to come. All right, guys. I appreciate all the work you put into this. I mean, this is 2 solid hours. We're going to get 4 episodes out of this. But I think we did a pretty good job of covering the book without trying to strain out all the details and take away the beauty of the imagery. So I really appreciate the work that you guys put into it. I know the audience will. And Kris, you've alluded to this a couple of times. We're going to try to make this bite-sized so we don't lose the audience. But just in case you haven't gotten enough for us, I'm going to put a link to the other videos in this series right over here. And over here, I'm going to put a link to the entire series on Revelation. You can also check out our series on evidences that we've done. And they'll all be there for your consumption. Guys, thanks again for being here. I appreciate you being on the program, appreciate your friendship, and appreciate your work in the kingdom even more than any of those other 2 things. Till we see you again, have a good day. God bless.